Welcome, Manu. It's a pleasure always to talk to somebody like you. This is the fourth episode of All That's Kerala Chat Along the Backwaters, and you bless us today with your presence. So welcome, Manu, once again. I cannot believe that somebody so young. You're born in 1990. You're just 30 years old, and as all our viewers will agree, looking so handsome, that you could write such erudite books, which aging historians will find it very difficult to write. Your books, hold me in wonder and thrall. Not only me, but many thousands upon thousands of people. The Ivory Throne. I've read that book. The Ivory Throne is the first one of yours. You published it at the age of 27. Chronicles of the House of Travancore is a study in history, which would have taken somebody like me, 7 or 8 decades to work out. But you did this in maybe 7 years. And then you came up with the Rebel Sultans, your second work, which narrates a history of the Deccan from the late 13th century to the early 18th century, 400 years of Deccan history. And your latest, the courtesan, the Mahatma, and the Italian Brahmin. I didn't know that there were Brahmins in Italy, but so be it. And now you're working on your fourth book, which I believe is not titled yet. So thanks for coming. We're talking about the kingdoms that came before Kerala. The history of Kerala is the history of its kingdoms. That's what I believe. It's the kingdoms of Kerala, the Cochin kingdom, but much more importantly, the Travancore kingdom, which was much larger. That has shaped our thinking today. It has shaped, I think, I would believe, every Keralite. It has shaped you, it has shaped me. I'm sure it's shaped many others. What do you think has been the role of the kingdoms of Kerala, particularly Travancore, about which you've written? What has been the role of the kingdoms in shaping Kerala?
So, in general, the princely states, as they were called, they don't get as much scholarly attention as they ought to. For example, they covered about 40% of India's landmass. That was the amount of territory that they controlled. Of course, it was split up into about 565. Some people have 600. The very fact that we don't even have an exact number of how many princely states there were, I think that tells you that it was sort of fragmented. But these bigger princely states did play a role in the political evolution of India. A lot of trends during the freedom struggle, especially experiments in economics, political experiments, developmental experiments, these were all being done in the major princely states. So, for instance, Mysore, for example, set a very high standard in terms of industrialization and progress, and beat all the British territories around it. It was far ahead in terms of quality of life for the Indian citizens that lived in the Mysore, within the bounds of Mysore, compared to Indians who lived in British rule territory. The same with Travancore, the same with Baroda. These were large and very successful and prominent principalities. And the rulers who they always faced this challenge from the British, who kept telling them, we are here to civilize Indians, we are here to teach you government. And many of these rulers in the princely states decided that they were going to not only do government well, they were going to beat the British at this whole game of governance. Which is why even in the case of Kerala, at the time of independence, Travancore had a much higher literacy rate than Malabar, which was directly under British rule. Travancore had a much higher quality of life than Malabar, which was under British rule. So it took a while for these lopsided indices to sort of settle once they'd become a unified state under the name Kerala. But the states do have a huge impact, and they did have a huge role to play in our overall political evolution. And it's not merely the economics and the numbers, or merely these political experiments, whether it's legislative experiments. A lot of the princely states had legislative councils long before in British India such bodies were thrown open to the people. A lot of them had universities set up, they had factories that they were setting up. But more importantly, their identity also mattered. So we have this view that all these Maharajas were just caricature figures who were drinking champagne and sort of sitting around, sitting in the palace constantly drowning in luxury. But there were people like that, but that isn't the full story. A lot of Maharajas were capable of resisting the British, as I described, by beating them at this business of enlightened government. Many of them did, command a lot of reverence and respect from their subjects. So, for instance, even a small state like Pudukkottai, which is in Tamil Nadu now, and it wasn't the best governed state, But even so, in 1949, when the Maharaja was told that Pudukkottai would have to merge with Madras Presidency, it would not even be retained. The state, with its existing boundaries, would not be retained even as a district. The local people and the local legislative council actually issued a resolution saying that they did not want Pudukkottai to lose its identity, because within the bounds of that princely state, it had formed and carved out its own identity. Sitting here now in the 21st century, we find it difficult to think that these identities would have mattered. Would people really have cared that they were from Travancore or Malabar? They were just Malayalis. But that's not the case. Even now, if you try and organize an arranged marriage in Kerala, you'll find a lot of Malabar people don't want to marry from Travancore. In Travancore, a lot of North Travancore people will not marry from South Travancore. There are all kinds of cultural sort of hangovers that are still alive because these identities did matter. And Travancore and Cochin specifically, these were the only major coastal states that existed in India. They continued to have major trade networks overseas. They did have a lot of export-import business, so their revenues were far ahead of their territories. So even though Travancore was only 7,600 square miles of land, in terms of its actual economic clout, it was among the top 5 states in India in terms of revenue, in terms of the kind of prestige it could command. And you find this. So when the Indian Union told the Maharaja that this would be merged with Kochi and then eventually joined into the Indian Union, etc., one of the concerns that the then Diwan and the Maharaja had was that why should we, when we already have so many advantages, we already have a highly literate population, we have an industrializing population, we've got all these good things happening for us, why should we surrender that and come at par with all these backward British ruled territories that now have come into the hands of the government of India? Think of it this way. There is a clamor growing today, for example, among South Indian states, saying that the South Indian states are richer. Why should they sort of subsidize the poorer North, which has a higher population, which has more backward indices, etc.? It's essentially something like that. The princely states, especially the big ones, did not think that it was fair to expect them to give up the sort of gains they had made in the business of development to sort of tag along and fall back one step with the rest of the country. It's not a question of good or bad, but these were real historical trends. And it sort of goes beyond that caricature I mentioned of royal families as just steeped in luxury and doing nothing but drinking champagne and partying and squandering the money in their treasuries. No, a lot of these states did have very interesting things happening. One of the earliest constitutions written in India was by Sir T. Madhav Rao, as the research of Rahul Sagar shows. He's doing a biography on Madhav Rao. Long before a constitution was written for independent India, in the 1870s, a man who worked in the princely states attempted a constitution for princely states, saying that these Indian ruled territories, they have an advantage that British ruled territories don't have. Their revenues, other than tribute paid to the British, their revenues don't leave the boundaries of the state. Their economies are in control of Indians. They can sort of, if they govern well, these territories can actually set a very high standard. This is the exact argument Dadabhai Naoroji made. Dadabhai Naoroji actually came and became Diwan of Baroda because he thought that the Indian states could be used to prove to the British that Indians were not only capable of government, they were capable of governing well, and there was no need for the British to be here to civilize Indians. So, if you look at the princely states properly, there's a whole lot to learn. And the best cases like Travancore and Cochin are merely one element in this. You go to other princely states, you learn equally fascinating stories. And it's as I said, scholars haven't devoted as much attention as they ought to, but I hope they will.
You're very right. I'm from Cochin, and I think Cochin owes a lot to the kingdom of Travancore, because the railways, as you write in your book, the railway that came to Ernakulam supported by the Travancore kingdom, and from Angamali to Thiruvananthapuram, it's still one of the main arterial roads in Kerala. So it's been a very long-sighted view that they have taken, building infrastructure, which I don't think has sort of happened the way it has in many other kingdoms that form part of India. And the plantations, the tea plantations of Munnar, the rubber plantations that we see across Kerala, I think we owe a lot to the Maharajas, to the kingdoms, for what we are today economically, financially, in terms of our literacy, in terms of education, which of course you mentioned. There are a couple of questions that come in. There's Susan was asking, who instilled in you this love for history?
This is a question I get asked a great deal, and I wonder whether I'm becoming too repetitive by giving the same answer. But I can only answer truthfully, and there's only one truth to this, which is that it all began, frankly, with these summer vacations. I didn't grow up in Kerala, but I used to take these summer vacations every year to come see my grandmother. And if I don't know if these days kids in Kerala see much of this, especially if they live in urban areas. But in my time, it was still the idea of going back to the ancestral village, where there's the carver, there's this, or a grove where you have your ancestral deities. There's the ancestral home was gone by then, long demolished and destroyed. But all of these other elements were there. And it was fascinating to be there, to listen to all the stories of the local groves, the local gods, the local festivals. And my grandmother, on top of that, had a very irreverent way of telling stories. So even the stories of her own parents, great uncles, ancestors, she would tell with the most sort of hilarious quality, with not censoring anything. By the time you're in your teens, I was treated very much as an adult, and she would tell me all kinds of hilarious things about great uncles who littered the entire village with illegitimate children. These great aunts, who great great grandmothers who were capable of taming elephants, things like that. And that's when I think I realized that we often think of people in the past as though they occupy some very different universe, whereas they were just as human as you and me. They had their own desires, they had their own weaknesses, they had their own strengths, they had their own prejudices and flaws. We ascribe ideas like, oh, grandmother, great grandmother, turn them into institutions. Whereas in their time, they were just interesting people, and they did whatever people do today, they did as well. And in the case of one of the things I came across when I was doing my research was this letter written in the 1870s by a man called Kerala Varma Vellugol Thambiran. He was called the Kalidas of Kerala, this great Sanskrit scholar, the father of modern Malayalam prose literature, this great poet and scholar and intellectual of the late 19th and early 20th century in Kerala. And what's interesting about this letter is that he's in his mid or late 20s when he's writing that letter, and he's talking about how he desired bhang and stronger narcotics and things like that. I found it really interesting that in his 20s, even a Kerala Galidasa was interested in bhang and narcotics and marijuana and things like that. And today have parents sort of telling their children off not to fall into these habits. And there you have the Kalidas of Kerala in the 1870s, pretty much leading a very similar sort of existence. He is also tempted by the same things that a lot of children today are tempted by. And I think that whole idea of looking at people in the past not as some kind of people you put on a pedestal, but as human beings who, irrespective of their flaws and weaknesses, they were still great for what they achieved. We just don't have to turn them into gods. It's fine to view them as multi-layered, three-dimensional human beings rather than as gods. And I got that a great deal from my grandmother's irreverence, from the fact that she was able to discuss her own ancestors and uncles and aunts and other people in the ancestral home with that kind of clarity and honesty. And I think that honesty is really what got me interested in these stories of history and in wanting to tell history through the stories rather than just a bunch of dates and a chronological sequence of events. And that's something I've attempted in the Ivory Throne also, where you see that when you think kings and queens or government officials make state policy, I mean, the ideal image is they're all sitting in a boardroom and all the best arguments are put forward and they choose whatever is best suited for the occasion. But in reality, it's constantly balancing out so many aspects. There are different interests at play. There are different feuds and vendettas within the family. All of those have to be balanced out. In the case of the Ivory Throne, the two Maharanis, they don't get along, and you find that different communities support different one or the other of these two Maharanis. So if one is supported by the Nayars, the other is supported by the Syrian Christians. And this palace feud, which is really a domestic feud between two royal sisters, ends up having very real policy repercussions on the people. So what is private also to become something that is public. And this happens even today. Even today, politicians don't necessarily take decisions based on what is wisest or what is the best. They take decisions on the basis of very many personal aspects. And this is the whole complaint about nepotism, people putting their family members up into positions of leadership and positions of political influence. All of this is the same thing. Human beings have always, in many ways, had the same impulses. Our contexts may change, but we behave often in the same way. I was very fascinated by that, by looking at historical figures as human beings who are capable of making mistakes and approaching history that way.
Very interesting, very interesting. Manu, speaking of your grandmother, speaking of women, um, two questions. One my own, one you spoke about. Nair supporting one group and the Syrian Christians supporting the other group. There's a question which has come in. Let me ask these two questions. One is mine. The first one: how much do you think the royal women in the Travancore household, the senior Maharani Setu Lakshmi Bai and the junior Maharani, the Setu Parvati Bai, who is actually in your book you say she controlled the King Chitra Tirunal. How much do you think these women have bequeathed to Kerala their legacy of women empowerment? That's my question. The second question I'll add to it, because you spoke of Syrian Christians, there's a question that came in from Wilson, who asks, I believe in your book you've written that Vasco da Gama came in 1498 and landed in Kappad looking for spices and Christians. And he wonders whether he really came looking for Christians. Two unrelated questions, but there you
in fact, a huge thing in those days, because there was still this belief about this mythical character in the East called Prester John. And if you look at a lot of the writing in Europe at that time, it's always these spurious letters that have come from Prester John. At one point, the Pope receives a letter from Prester John saying that he lives in this magical kingdom in the East and has this heap of spices, and he wants to form an alliance and things like that. But yes, more importantly, they had already heard that there were Christians in the East. And more importantly, in India, because it wasn't like the news hadn't trickled through the existing channels of trade towards Europe and towards other parts of the world. But, and it's in the earliest writings that there's a contemporary of Vasco da Gama who was on that first journey, who's left an account of that time. And they do quite, Vasco da Gama and his party landed, they actually think that they've come across Christians. They even go into a Bhagavati temple, and they think, okay, these are just very weird. This is very weird iconography, but this is all about Christian saints, and that Bhagavati is actually the Virgin Mary and things like that. And they were anxiously and actively looking for Christians. And we must remember that what is ironic about that period is a lot of Indian politics, although we at that now sort of ascribed a lot of politics at that time as having some kind of religious clash of civilizations, quality happening at that time. It wasn't the case. It was happening in Europe. In Europe, a lot of politics was infused with religious fervor and things like that. In India, it wasn't quite that much. But the Europeans brought that sort of fervor to India. They were looking for Christians. They were looking for these long-lost Christians that they'd heard of, but never actually in recent times had any contact with. The spices, of course, is not surprising, because that was the whole point of these trade networks that were constructed. Now, the other question on the Maharanis, they did, bequeath a great deal to Kerala, for the simple reason that one of them, Setu Lakshmi Bai, the senior Maharani, personally ruled in the 1920s. It was in her time that a Syrian Christian woman, for the first time, was made, the head of the health department, which is essentially, you can call it the de facto health minister at the time. It was at her time that legal education was thrown open to women, which led to Anna Chandy becoming one of the first judges in the Indian legal universe. It was in her time that women were allowed entry into the legislature and into this popular, consultative assembly called the Sri Moolam Popular Assembly. It was in her time that the first feature film was made. And when the female lead was attacked because she was a Dalit woman who played an upper caste Naya character, it was the Maharani who gave protection to that particular actress. And what you find is that, she did not promote individual women. She created spaces for women to sort of thrive in future as well. So other than her health minister and one or two other cases, you can't really point out saying she helped this woman or that woman. She actually created the idea that women needed to step forward and claim their own space. So one of the innovative things that she set up was that, every girl who went to college in Travancore would automatically receive an invitation to tea in the palace with the Maharani. Now, this is a time when the royals are almost treated like semi-divine figures. So to get an occasion to come and sit down with them and have tea is a very rare sort of honor. She's trying to sort of promote the idea that, she's showing support for the idea of women going to college. That's a minor thing, but, putting them in the legislature, hoping that they would hereafter not be nominated, but actually stand election, protecting an actress who was being harassed by upper caste goons, appointing a woman as her health minister. These were very serious changes that were made then. More importantly, small changes of other kinds also. By the time her reign ended, about I think 1/5 of all the births in Travancore were already being handled by professionally trained midwives. 1/5 today may not sound very, like a great number, but where there was nothing having 1/5 of all births under trained hands is a very remarkable thing to have achieved in a space of 5 or 6 years. So, she directly ruled, so she had a direct impact on policy in Kerala. Her sister, the junior Maharani, who sort of was the power behind the throne for the next Maharaja, who was the junior Maharani's son, she sort of is a slightly different character in that she did not directly rule, and therefore you can't really trace that many policy aspects, but she was a woman who really had a spine and was able to do a number of unorthodox things. So, where the Maharajas of Travancore were extremely orthodox, and they, decades after the first Maharajas from North India had already gone to Europe and seen the world, the Travancore Maharajas were still refusing to go abroad, thinking that crossing the Kala Pani is a bad thing. But the junior Maharani in 1932, along with her daughter, went all the way to Europe, broke that taboo, and came back and told her son, now next year you come with me, and she took her son along as well. She's the one who, in the late 1930s, in a temple town like Trivandrum, Trivandrum is even now a very orthodox place. It's much of its culture still revolves around the temple and this conspicuous piety about it. And in the 1930s, she gathered all the sort of grandees of Trivandrum and put Margaret Sanger, the great birth control activist, on stage and made her deliver a speech on birth control. Now, you can only picture all these upper caste bureaucrats, very stuffy orthodox men sitting in a room being lectured by a white woman about the importance of birth control and talking things that men were not used to talking in public with strange ladies from abroad. So she was able to break a lot of these orthodox bounds. She was able to challenge a lot of these orthodox norms. And that made her an extremely interesting woman. And of course, her politics was slightly mischievous. She was not very, she was a little, let's say, cunning and shrewd and very capable of getting her way, even if, it wasn't always by the best of means. And the two Maharanis did not get along, though they were sisters. But both of them, in their own ways, did become icons to a lot of women at that time. And you find that this you can't say that it did not have an impact on Kerala. With Sethu Lakshmibai, as I've traced in the book, it's very clear what the impact was, because you can directly correlate her policy to the impact it had on the lives of women on the ground, even in the villages. With Sethu Parvati Bai, in many ways it's a much more intellectualized thing, where she sort of stands up and says, I'm going to break a number of rules, even though the men around me say that women should not be breaking these rules. And she, a lot of the ill repute that sort of settled around her name partly came from this, the fact that she was able to rile up men by doing things they did not expect her to do.
When I read your book, there seems to be an unconscious bias in favor of the senior Maharani. Is that something I felt, or is there a tilt towards a senior Maharani?
No, it wasn't unconscious at all. I'm definitely more sympathetic to her, because the whole point of writing the book was to resurrect her from the margins. Because if you look, I suppose a lay reader may not see it, but if anybody who's familiar with Travancore history looks at all the existing books that have been written, they are all heavily tilted towards the junior Maharani's side of the story. And what was very startling was that the records do not support such a view. The records show that the senior Maharani was indeed ill-treated. Now, for example, even a small thing like the fact that she ruled the state for 7 years, and for a whole year the junior Maharani's son, as soon as he became Maharaja, would not determine the question of her pension. And finally, after a lot of bickering and haggling, he agreed. First, he wanted to give her about 46,000 rupees a year. The Viceroy and the British were actually scandalized, because they said this woman is ruled with such capacity and with so much hard work for 7 years. That's too little to give her, on a yearly basis, 46,000 a year. So they said you have to increase it. And finally, grudgingly, he agreed to 75,000 rupees a year. Now, what is interesting is a few years later, the Maharaja's brother, when he turned, fixed on him. And this 18 or 19-year-old boy is given a handsome allowance of 100,000 rupees a year, whereas the senior Maharani, who actually ruled for 7 years, who had actually enjoyed sovereign power and actually dedicated her life entirely during that period to her people, she ends up with a much smaller pension as compared to a 19-year-old boy who happens to be the Maharaja's very fond sibling. Similarly, and it's not just the British records, even post-independence, when VP Menon, MK Vellodi, Sardar Patel, all of them were discussing the integration of Travancore with the Indian Union, one of the things they were startled by, and this is an actual quote from one of those letters, where I think it's MK Vellodi writing to Menon. He says that the senior Rani had stopped ruling in 1931. She hadn't ruled for the next 18 years. But he said that she remains even more popular among the people than the junior Maharani and the Maharaja, and that she had not been treated well. In fact, one of the things that he found rather appalling was that in all the discussions the Maharaja had about the future of his family, the privy purse, what allowances were to be settled on all of the family members, the exact quote is something along the lines of, not once did he refer even to the existence of the senior Maharani. So, you're giving up the kingdom, you're discussing your own future, you're securing your finances, and you don't even mention the senior Maharani as though she does not even exist. And this is actually put on paper not by a British observer, but by an observer from the independent government of India. And it's the government of India who actually, in their internal memos, they say that the senior Maharani has been treated poorly and she's widely respected in the state, but she's not got her due. And therefore, it is up to us to ensure that she receives a decent allowance and settlement. So, another record at the same time, again, VP Menon is sort of grudgingly observes that the Maharaja calls the senior Maharani to his palace and basically tells her, whatever allowance you've been getting so far, you will continue to get it. And the senior Maharani asks him, okay, I don't mind, but what are the others getting paid? I deserve to know whether the others are getting more as compared to my two daughters. And the Maharaja basically says it's not her business. And, she's sort of left adrift because neither does she have the full power of royalty, though she's a member of the royal family, because she's been cornered, nor is anybody watching out for her interests. And she does end up suffering for that. Now, anytime people talk to me, especially in Trivandrum, there are still people who have a lot of devotion for the branch of the royal family that lives there, which is the junior Maharani's branch. And they often tell me, the records may say all this, but we can't believe that someone like Chitra Tirunal, the last Maharaja, would have done something so cruel to his aunt. A single episode encapsulates this. The senior Maharani built so the Maharaja lived in what was the 106 or 107 room Kaudia Palace, this huge, splendid building. The senior Maharani lived in a 20 room or 18 room structure in Pujapura. That's practically a large bungalow rather than a palace. Now, this is a building that she constructed. She raised her children there. She ruled from there. She had spent her entire adult life in that particular structure, but she's the one who designed and built it. It's a small structure, not particularly valuable. But when the division of the royal family's properties took place, the Maharaja claimed even her own palace as his private property. And this case went all the way to the Supreme Court. He actually battled his own aunt all the way to the Supreme Court. And it was M.S. Vajayathan, because this building was given away later to the Sri Chitra Institute in Trivandrum, the excellent medical research institute. And he's the one who told me how he will always feel sad to his dying day that when they actually took custody of the palace, they took the keys of the palace from the senior Maharani, but the check had to be given to the Maharaja's family. Now, when people say there's a bias in favor of the senior Rani, it's partly because of this. I definitely do have sympathy for her, because a woman who, even the roof that was over her head was taken away by her nephew. A lot of people in Trivandrum believe he was Pratyaksha Padmanabha and all that, and that is fine. That is a matter of faith. But the paper trail is absolutely clear that she was not treated well.
Sorry. Three quick unrelated questions. One is, has your conscious bias in favor of the senior Maharani put you in contradiction with the Travancore family, Travancore Kingdom's family now, because they are the descendants of the junior Maharani? First question. Second is a question from somebody who is your namesake, Manu, who is, I think, speaking from Qatar, Doha. He is saying that he's asking how you can, what was your childhood that gave you this interest in history? And third is my own question, which is, towards the end of the reign, towards the end of the reign, before independence, the Travancore Kingdom came under the influence of Sir C.P. Ramaswamy Iyer. He was a huge presence, a very, very intelligent, clever man. And he wanted to he wanted to be, Travancore to be independent. What do you think would have happened to Kerala if Sir C.P. had got his way with his declaration of independence for Travancore? Would it have spurred the Kingdom of Kochi also to declare independence? Would Kerala today have been, I don't know, like Singapore or Malaysia, or perhaps more like Thailand, because Thailand also venerates the king and the monarch very much? Or would it have been a failed state? Or it would have had the same history as Hyderabad had?
Yeah, I think it would have gone the Hyderabad way, because the Indian government was not prepared to acknowledge any claims to independence. And what in Hyderabad is called police action, it's just a word that the Indian government put out to sort of make it sound somewhat more palatable. It was actually a military invasion. It was not at all a pleasant affair. There was also a huge amount of violence that followed, which were not taught in textbooks. Travancore, that would have happened in Travancore. But more importantly, although Travancore had the revenues to stay independent, and that is true, although Travancore had a very advanced government system, it had an authoritarian figure like Sir CP, and who enjoyed the full backing of the royal family when he wanted to do this. It had all the numbers in its favor to survive as an independent state. And more importantly, it wasn't landlocked. It had access to the Arabian Sea, which actually would have made it a fairly viable unit, except for one core disequilibrium in this whole equation, which was that the state was sinking under the weight of its own contradictions. Now, Travancore was established in the 18th century. And when the Maharaja at that time, Martandavarma, set it up, he set it up as this ultra-Brahminical court setup. So, the royal family was highly orthodox. It surrounded itself with these Brahminical institutions. And from that time, you start seeing that there is this churn on the ground. There is resistance on the ground to that kind of political setup. You see one resistance or one mutiny happening in what is the Veluthambi period, the early 19th century. Then, of course, after that, there's no armed rebellion, but the Nayars and the Iravas, etc., start asserting political rights throughout the 19th century. And by the middle of the 20th century, by the late 1930s, what rears its head in this, it's already an enlightened state. People have a very high standard of living. The royal family is respected. And yet, what rears its head in the state is communism, the complete extreme of a Brahminical Hindu state. And Travancore advertised itself as the Hindu state of Travancore. Communism would have really been the death of Travancore. It would have caused internal chaos, because if you look at the facts of the matter, after the Veluthambi period in 1810, which was the last time when the state had to field arms against its own people who had risen in rebellion, the next time blood was shed of Travancore's own people on the streets was during Sir CP's tenure, during the Punapra Vailar violence, etc., against the communists. So even if Travancore had survived, the communists would have created a lot of trouble in Travancore. In fact, Travancore perhaps got the better end of the deal, because by merging with the Indian Union, it was able to put that chapter behind it. If Travancore had continued, I think it would have seriously dissolved into violence. That is, in my view, what would have happened. But technically, if you look at all the parameters, it had all the capacity to continue as an independent state. And I think Sir CP was also initially using this as a bargaining chip. I think he realized that some kind of accommodation with the Indian Union was inevitable. But by pitching for independence, he was setting the stage for a compromise where the state and the royal family continue to have some kind of special arrangement with the Indian Union. And initially that's what the Indian Union promised. They said, you give us defense, communications, and foreign policy, the same things that the British government handled, and we'll let you internally stay more or less independent, provided you have representative democracy within the state. The Rajas all agreed. It's in 1949 that the Rajas are told that, look, now you must merge with the Indian Union. Your states cannot continue as they were before. And here again, the dynamics between Travancore and Cochin are interesting, because there are records to show that the Kochi Rajas sort of encouraged their state being used as a platform for communist activists who would use Cochin as a staging point and then provoke trouble in Travancore, because there was a historical rivalry also between the two royal families. And Cochin was more than happy to merge with the Indian Union. They were not very caught up in the idea of independence and glory and things like that. Now, going back to there were three questions. So going back to the first question on, my sympathies for the senior Maharani. So as I said, all the existing literature till I wrote my book was chiefly in favor of the junior Maharani's branch. Great reverence, wonderful royal family, only did great and wonderful things. And then I discovered that the records did not show that. And the whole book got written because as an 18-year-old, I wrote a blog based on some initial sort of letters, etc., that I had seen, which I said, and in a blog that I thought nobody read, I'd written about how the senior Rani was ill-treated. And the backlash that it received in the comments, today people talk about trolling on Twitter and things like that. This is 2008. And it was really startling to find that so many people, these Raja Bhaktas, were upset with a random blog written by an 18-year-old. Except that, instead of putting me off, I decided to dig deeper into the subject. And more material started to be found, which sort of supported the idea that at the very least, the senior Maharani deserved better. And members who are related to the junior Maharani's family also have told me this. Of course, they couldn't be quoted by name, but they all admitted that all said and done, the junior Rani could have been treated well. The senior Rani could have been treated better. So there was that whole thing. I did receive a legal notice for the book, but again, I'm not pulling these things out of thin air. I'm not making an argument in a polemical sense and saying or saying that this is what I believe happened. No, everything is backed by archival sources. So then the criticism was, oh, but these are British sources. But that's not true. They are from British archives, but the documents themselves were not written by the British. The letters that are sitting in the British archives are still signed by the Maharaja. So when the Maharaja denies his aunt a decent allowance, it is signed by him or his manager. When the Maharaja, orders that she return all the jewelry that she had in her possession and send it for inspection every 6 months, it is his palace officer who's written this. The documents just happen to be sitting in London. It does not make it British written documents. These are documents of the royal family that the British happen to cart away to London. So even the claim that because it was written by the British, these are not reliable documents, I thought was rather amusing, because the documents have the stamp and the signature of members of the family. And even the National Archives in Delhi have a lot of these documents. So, so obviously they were not pleased, partly because for them, the Junior Rani's grandmother. It's not, for me, it's a historical figure. So I can bring a certain objective gaze to it. I can look upon her as a historical figure without being invested in her personality. But for them, it was their grandmother. So I understand that, it was a little bit of a shock for them to read that, things about her that may not have been very unflattering. But, I'm as a writer, what is your loyalty? Do you stick to the facts and what the record shows, or do you sort of stick to people's feelings? I think the answer is clear. Your duty is to history, and the frank truth is that there was a far larger quantity of damaging material in the archives, and I did not include it in the book because the whole idea was not to have published salacious details or publish things for the sake of sort of titillating people. Only things insofar as they concern the senior Maharani's life, who had to give up a palace, give up her royal existence, and die in obscurity as a complete nobody in Bangalore. I think only those elements were included in the book. Anything else that was, gossipy for its own sake was not included. I've left out a great deal that could have scandalized people. If my intention was to hurt and scandalize, there was a great deal more that could have been included, but that was never the intention. The intention and the argument that, it's their private thing does not quite stand when you're talking about a royal family, because power comes down the family line. So politics and the private is merged or joined at the hip when you're talking about a royal family. You cannot divide the private from the political where you're discussing a royal family, because the private and political, as I said earlier also, did have repercussions in terms of communal relations, in terms of political relations, and all of that. So, it was a tricky sort of row. For the 6 years I was writing the book, I constantly reached out and tried to obtain interviews and things like that. I was constantly turned down. Finally, one of the members gave me a brief written statement from which I quoted in the book. But other than that, they did not cooperate, which is sad, because if I had had their side of the story, I would have happily included it. I was honest from the beginning that the records are not very flattering to their ancestor, and that I can't camouflage it. I can't whitewash the records, because that is disingenuous. So I admitted that the records are not flattering, but I was willing to hear their side of the story and also nuance the records accordingly. But they were not prepared to engage, which is sad, I think, because the book does, I think, have that one missing piece, which was that the Junior Rani's family did not cooperate and speak to me when I was doing my research.
Manu, there's a comment coming in from Niti. I think Niti, I've got a daughter named Niti. I think it's her commenting in from Philadelphia. She asks, what do you think would be the state of mind of the royals as they begin to lose power in an independent India? Have you been able to glimpse their thoughts, their feelings when they lose power? For example, the senior Maharani, she lost her power.
It's actually the most fascinating thing, because, her...
What would have been the state of their mind?
Yeah, Senior Maharani had a daughter called Lalitamba Bai. So this is the other thing, right? People often think that when you say the royal family of Travancore, it's just the branch that lives in Trivandrum, which is not true, because that's just 7 members who live there. The royal family has an overall 39 or 40 member strength, and about 33 of them belong to the Senior Maharani's branch. In fact, the next in line to enjoy the title of Maharaja, the next 3 or 4 men, all belong to the Senior Maharani's branch. And after the Padmanabha Swami case, I actually wrote in an op-ed in the Hindu how it will be interesting to see if power will be handed over to that branch again, because the Supreme Court is very clear that succession is matrilineal. It has to follow the old matrilineal custom. And under the matrilineal custom, the eldest male member born in all the branches taken together is the successor. And the next 4 or 5 such male members belong to the senior Maharani's branch. So after she gave up power in 1931, they have had no power in the temple till today. But the next few decades may see members of their family returning to the temple after an absence of very many decades. But what is interesting is her daughter, because she was ill-treated and because she was cornered in the family, her older daughter and her younger both, they had no incentive to stay on in Trivandrum. They had seen their mother being insulted. They had lived, as the younger daughter put it, she said it was like living in a golden cage, because you were royalty, but you did not have the power. Within the family, you were ill-treated. So the world saw you as royalty, living with, with limousines around you and bodyguards. But you did not actually have any power. You were actually in a cage. So the moment independence came and the integration took place, and Sardar Patel's people bestowed allowances directly on members of the family, which meant that financially they became free of the Maharaja's control. The first thing the older daughter did, she flew off to Bangalore, purchased a bungalow in Bangalore, and decided to give up her royal titles. So from being Uttaram Tiruna Lalitamba by Tamburaj, she became simply Lalita Varma, put all her daughters into public schools, and absolutely hated the idea of royalty after that. In fact, the government used to send her these checks every quarter for her allowance. And one of her daughters told me, using the Malayalam word verpa, saying that every time she saw that envelope, she would get verpa because it would address her as Princess Lalitamba Bai, and she hated that title because she had completely disinvested from her royal heritage. But what's interesting is for the kids, especially, so the oldest daughter born to this princess, who is the Bangalore-based artist called Rukmini Varma, she's the present titular Maharani of Travancore. I've often had this, every time I was interviewing her, I would ask her about this whole leap from growing up in a palace where, even to go for her 4 o'clock walk in the garden as a 10-year-old girl, there would be about 16 servants following her. 2 bodyguards in front, 2 on either side, 2 behind, and all the 8 or 9 maid servants attached to her, and somebody holding up a parasol. It was a procession that used to go out for a 9-year-old girl to take a walk. And from there, being transplanted to Bangalore, where you used to go to school and sit in a classroom with all your European friends and things like that. She said it was a leap. It was not easy for them. And for the first generation that left the palace, she thinks, it was neither here nor there, which is that you've left the palace and you've moved on, but you've not completely moved on either, because the weight of the heritage is still present. The memories of that palace life are still present. And, she often joked during these interviews, which I would record with her, about how the first generation squandered so much money because they had no idea what to do with it, because they had never actually dealt with money in their lives. This Maharani's daughter, this Princess Lalitamba Bai, when there's this wonderful story about her going to Bangalore Club, where she decides she's going to go shopping in one of the shops that exist within the club. And she goes in and she picks up a basket and throws in a lot of things into the basket. And she reaches the till. And the lady says, she counts everything and she says, okay, that'll be 89 rupees, madam. And this lady has no idea what 89 rupees are, because she's never actually dealt with cash in her life. And her driver, who's standing behind her, has to sort of tell the lady, you let her go, I'll pay, because she doesn't know how to handle money. She doesn't know the value of a rupee. From being as unprepared for a modern or a post-royal world as that, this lady starts driving her own car. She starts cooking in her own kitchen. And I remember a cousin of hers, who's not a member of the royal family, telling me that if there were no servants available, she was not about picking up the broom and cleaning the house herself. She actually trained herself over the years to become more and more independent. And she completely managed to move on. But her kids did not necessarily manage to move on, because, on the one hand, even what's interesting is poverty, right? This time, when I went to interview the Maharani's younger daughter, who passed away in 2017, I went and saw her in 2011 to interview her. She sort of gloomily told me, oh, we've fallen upon such hard times. All the old wealth, etc., is gone, and we neither have the palace, which was anyway taken away by the Maharaja, nor have we managed to fully cope with this, and we've fallen on these hard times. And it was amusing to see that hard times for her, when I looked around, she lived in this bungalow. There were about 5 or 6 servants over there. There were about 3 or 4 cars in the garage. But that was hard times for her, because it wasn't really about the money. It was about not knowing what your place in the world was. It was about not knowing how to really plan your future after this. And all that it's sort of sad in a way. I mean, there's obviously a lot of privilege, so I don't mean to overstate the tragedy in all this, but equally, it is also sad. The greatest sort of the tragic sort of character in this is the Maharani herself, because she was queen at the age of 5. From the age of 5, not even her father would refer to her by name. Everybody called her Your Highness. When this 5-year-old girl walked into a room, people saw not a girl, they saw the queen. She grew up surrounded by 300 servants. At the age of 60, to give up that lifestyle which you've known from the age of 5, to move to Bangalore and become a complete nobody. And her name used to be Her Highness Shri Padmanabha Sevini Vanchi Dharma Vardhini Raja Rajeshwari Maharani Puradam Tirmal Setu Lakshmi Bai Artingal Mutadabbra, and companion of the most imperial order of the Crown of India. That was her full title, Senior Maharani of Travancore. And she actually, after moving to Bangalore, starts signing her letters as simply Srimati Setu Lakshmi Bai. She even gives up her titles. And for her, it must have been really heart-wrenching because, one by one, the palaces are taken over by the government. Her main palace is taken over by her nephew. She doesn't have a roof over her head. Other private investments she had made in property from her own savings, one is taken by the government for the agriculture college. The other is taken by the ITDC for a tourist thingy. So suddenly, one by one, her possessions are stripped from her. And there is this one poignant moment where the Bangalore government, the Karnataka government, passes the Land Ceiling Act. And even the bungalow, which is about 2-3 acres on Richmond Road in Bangalore in the 50s, even that is too large for one person to own. So she's forced to cut up this property, the last property that she owns. And it's so interesting. She had this rather long sort of structure that she lived in. Even that house had to be divided into 3 portions. So the kitchen had to be given to one granddaughter, the back wing had to be given to another granddaughter, and the wing in which she lived had to be chopped up and given to somebody else, because even the house could not be retained in her name. And she told a visitor, once I had a whole kingdom, then that is gone. Then I thought I had the palace, but that is gone too. Then I thought I had this house, but now I can only say I have this room. And that, again, this was a very rich woman, even in retirement, even after moving to Bangalore. It wasn't like she was poor. But there is something sad about that. There is something sad that, for a lady who had 300 servants and 21 gun salutes when she moved around, the fact that when she died, it was just 20 people around her in an electric crematorium like anybody else, there is something sort of gloomy about that arc. And the fact that she was able to cope with it, the fact that she was able to see all her possessions taken away, and things being auctioned and things like that, it must have been sad, but she managed. And I think that was perhaps the triumph that that marked her personality.
You brought that ethos very well in the book. I remember when you speak about it now, I remember reading it and feeling that pain in my mind as well. But hearing your earlier part, I realize it's tough being a royal. I always wanted to be a prince, but now I realize that a life of pie is better than a life of a prince. But you brought it out beautifully. It's not easy being a royal. Thank you so much for it. Let me ask you a question. Who is Indrani?
My sister. She's the one who got me into reading, which is why the first book I ever wrote is dedicated to her. Because if she hadn't thrust, when I was this very restless 11 or 12-year-old, she was the one who thrust a book into my hands and told me to calm down and read. So, I thought it would only be fair that when I wrote my first book, it should be dedicated to my sister.
Thank you so much. I was wondering who that is. Thanks for that. I think we are running short of time, so I'm going to wind it up. The Ivory Tower, I believe, is being made into a serial. Is it likely to be made into a movie? And if I were to make it into a movie, would you be my lead actor? You're as good as or better than Prithviraj and Mohanlal. Why Mohanlal? Jayasuriya and all those young stars.
You already flattered me during the introduction by saying some overkind things, and now you're flattering me again by making such remarks. But no, one thing I'm aware of is what I can do.
I'm in awe of you. I'm a very frank.
No, I think it's useful in life to know what one is good at and acknowledge what one is not good at. What I'm good at is a decent amount of writing. What I'm not good at is all these other things like acting and scripts and screenplays and things like that. Yes, I mean, a production house has taken it on for a Netflix type series. It's not, these things take a couple of years to really settle. They have to write a screenplay, they have to plan the mood boards, there's a whole lot of things that go into this, get a platform on board, see if it can actually be told as a series, etc. It can't be done as a movie because the story is far too complicated to condense into 1.5 hours. And if you try and do that, it will probably be condensed very poorly. It will be done very badly. So it's perhaps wiser to do a mini series of at least 5 or 6 or 10 episodes of 1 hour each. That may do greater justice to all the layers that exist in the story. I hope it happens. I'm looking forward to the day when they call me and say, okay, finally cameras are going to roll. As of now, they're still doing their groundwork. And, till the cameras roll, there's no guarantee that it'll actually take off. So we'll have to wait and see how that happens.
Thank you so much. I'll take one last question from Admiral Muralidharan. He wants to know what has been the influence of the Cheras and the Pandyas on the Travancore and the Cochin dynasties. Very quickly, as we are running short of time.
Completely different periods. All the Rajas in Kerala claim some kind of descent from the Cheras. The Pandyas, not so much. Pandyas, of course, did at different times have a degree of political power over Kerala. But the two families that do claim descent from the Pandyas are not the Travancore and Cochin families, but the Poonar Rajas and the Pandalam Rajas. Those two have connections to the Pandyas. The Travancore and Cochin families have different connections to the Cheras that they claim. Much of this often is legitimizing processes, which is to say that you always legitimize yourself by claiming some link to the long lost ruler. So, for example, the last Cheraman Perumal who left Kerala and went off to Mecca, as the story goes, all the rulers of Kerala, the Zamorin claims that he was his most loyal warrior, and that the Cheraman Perumal gave him a sword and said, "Conquer all the territory you can and you shall be king." And that's how the Zamorins carved out their power. The Kochi Rajas claimed that they were Cheraman Perumal's matrilineal heirs, which made them legitimate heirs, and they are therefore the highest Kshatriyas in Kerala. Travancore claims that they were born from Cheraman Perumal's children, not the nephews, but the children, and therefore they are also descendants. Everybody sort of claims a connection to the old Chera rulers of yore, but a lot of this is myth making, a lot of this is legitimizing processes. And Travancore as an entity is only 18th century. Earlier it was Wayanad and it was split into much smaller territorial groupings. There would be all kingdoms in Kerala, of course, do have some level of impact from the original Chera framework that existed. The Zamorins' ancestors, the Kolatiris, the Wayanad Rajas, they were all governors of the Cheras long ago. We know that much from inscriptional evidence from the 9th century. But beyond that, beyond that natural trajectory of descent or chronology from the Chera period into the modern period, there isn't much, because the periods are completely different.
Thank you, Manu. I would hate to stop this conversation. I'm thoroughly enjoying it. I'm learning so much as I speak to you. I'd like to speak to you the whole night. You could go on forever. What's interesting about you is not merely the vastness of what you speak about, the huge canvas in which you speak about, but the depth that you go into on each of these subjects. I'm sure you could go on and on many of these topics if I have not interrupted you. It's been a pleasure talking to you. Before I close, I just want to announce that the next episode, which would be on the 3rd of October, this year, of course, Saturday, would be with Mr. Bose Krishnamachari. Bose Krishnamachari does not require any introduction. He would be our guest. He's the founder of the Kochi Biennale, 2012, 2014, 2016, 2018, and now 2020. This is going to be a very different type of Biennale, but he's going to speak more about his journey. It's going to be called At Home in the World, a Malayali's journey in art. How he, coming up from a background, a village rural background, has reached the top of the world of art and culture, not only in Kerala, in India, but across the world. So we would be chatting with Sri Bose Krishnamachari as our guest 2 Saturdays from now on the 3rd of October. Thank you very much, Manu, once again. It's been a pleasure talking to you. I'm not flattering you. I'm in awe of you. I just can't believe that someone can write such a erudite book at such a young age. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Any last words you would like to tell us about the kingdoms that came before Kerala?
Well, all I'll say is that we've only scratched the surface of the kind of stories that are available in our country. Anything as far as Indian history is concerned, that the amount of drama, the amount of ingenuity, the amount of fascinating detail that exists, it's really a tragedy that these days we're fighting about who lost a battle or what religion was at fault and things like that, when in reality there's so much to learn and so much more to excavate, and we're losing ourselves. Instead of doing that hard work, we're losing ourselves in pointless debates, and it's quite sad. I think I hope more people will do interesting histories on forgotten chapters, forgotten figures, forgotten women, and sort of resurrect the story of India also through the eyes of these women and long lost characters.
Thank you, Manu, once again.